If there's any kids that want to come up, no pressure. Yay! Y'all just sit right there so I can see you. Thank you. Good morning. Have you had a good week at school? Good. You too? Good. I think you were the one last week who didn't like school. So that's great. Good job. Okay, so have you ever just wanted something really, really bad? And you could picture it in your mind just how perfect it would be if you got it, right? And then you got it. And it wasn't exactly what you thought it would be. I know all of them have, but maybe you're too young yet. But sometimes you just want something so bad, and you can see it. You know exactly what it's going to be. And then when you get it, it's not like you pictured it. Well, that's a little bit what we're going to talk about this morning, is that the disciples wanted Jesus to be the Messiah, the one who's going to come and save them, save their country, right? From the bad guys. And they recognized it. Peter said, wow, you're the Christ. You're the one. You're the Messiah. And then Jesus told them stuff that didn't sound like the Messiah they were thinking was coming. And they were thinking, well, something's wrong with this. But you know what they forgot? What they forgot is that God always gives you more and better. Just because we can't picture it doesn't mean it's not going to be better. So think about that if you're thinking you're really wanting something and it's not quite what you thought. You can make it work here, but in the end, God gives you the best. Have another good week at school. Okay? Okay, thank you. Gives you hope, doesn't it? Do you know the expression, you can get it right and still get it wrong? Peter, in our reading last week, calls Jesus the Christ, and for doing so is called the Rock, and is given the keys to the kingdom. This week, just 3 verses later, Peter is called Satan, a stumbling block. Why? Because Peter privately rebukes Jesus for saying that he must die. Peter had it right. Jesus is the Christ. And Peter had it wrong. For the Christ of God will die. 2,000 years later, we know that Jesus the Christ dies. But you know, you can get it right and still get it wrong. What must be asked is this: how is the death of Jesus different from all others who have died for and in their faith? Now, Socrates died, a wise man. Cheerfully and calmly, he drank the hemlock. For him, death was a breakthrough to a higher and purer life. The death of Socrates was a festival of liberty. The zealot martyrs who were crucified by Romans died conscious of their rightness with God. Based on this rightness, they believed God would eternally bless them and eternally punish their enemies. The Stoics, torn to pieces in the Roman arena, demonstrated their superiority. They met death without fear and without hope. Even the Christian martyrs went calmly to their deaths, conscious of their unity with Christ. But clearly, Jesus died a different death. Unlike the examples just given, his death was not a fine death. The Synoptic Gospels all agree that he was greatly distressed and troubled. Mark 14 says his soul was sorrowful even unto death. In Hebrews it says that Jesus died with loud cries and tears. And in Mark 15 we are told that he died with a loud and incoherent cry. Jesus clearly died with every expression of great and profound hopelessness and horror. Compared to Socrates, to the Zealots, to the Stoics, even to the Christian martyrs, there is something vastly different in Jesus' death. So how can this be explained? conflict Jesus has with the Pharisees over the law and the conflict with the Zealots and the Romans over politics each provide an explanation of his condemnation as a blasphemer and his crucifixion as a rebel. But they do not explain the true pain of his suffering and death. We can begin to understand the uniqueness of Jesus' death if we see his death not in relation to the Jews or the Romans, not in relation to the law or political power, but in relation to his God and his Father. His God and his Father, whose closeness and grace Jesus proclaimed to all of Israel. In order to understand the uniqueness of the death of Jesus, which is so unlike other stories of the deaths of great witnesses of the faith, the place to begin is with Jesus' life and ministry. Like no one before him in Israel, Jesus proclaimed the closeness of God and demonstrated it amongst the incurable, the rejected, the hated, that God was nearby and gracious, with a graciousness that does not judge, but saves. In his own relationship with God, Jesus had gone beyond the framework of the tradition of God's covenant with Israel, the covenant in which the closeness of God was dependent on the covenant and the law and Moses. But Jesus often called God exclusively my Father. This is an expression of a fellowship with God which is not mediated or negotiated through a covenant or the nation or tradition. It's a direct fellowship, a direct connection, a direct relationship. The unparalleled claim of Jesus includes forgiveness of all sin on earth by God's grace, not by sacrifice, not by adherence to the law, not even through family lineage, but by God's own grace. By identifying himself with God in this way, Jesus was clearly believing that God reciprocated and identified himself with Jesus and Jesus' words. Anyone who lived and preached so close to God and his grace could not regard his being handed over to death on the cross as a mishap, or as human misunderstanding, or even as a final trial. Instead, Jesus must have experienced it as a rejection by the very God he had dared to call my Father. To have preached and demonstrated God as close and full of grace to save, and then to be abandoned, delivered up to death as one rejected, must have been the torment of hell. Jesus' cries from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He doesn't say these words as the psalmist first wrote the words. It's not the cry of a man who leans on the covenant or the law or ancestry or tradition to save him. It is the cry of a man, the cry to the God of grace, the cry to the God he called my Father. To cry, my God, why have you forsaken me, is not a return to the law, the God of his fathers, for that would be the end of his unique message and special mission. No, it is a cry of ultimate despair, the anguished cry of a man who is throwing himself into the arms of God. This cry echoes across the complete separation between Son and Father, Father and Son. Jesus is rejected by the religious authorities as a blasphemer and by the Romans as a rebel. In both cases, we could speak of a misunderstanding. But between God and Jesus, there can be no such misunderstanding. To do so means that at the end, either Jesus misrepresented God, or God misunderstood Jesus and abandoned him. Remember, you can get it right and still get it wrong. That the Christ died is right. But to avoid being wrong requires a revolution in our understanding of God. It is not the deaths of Socrates or Zealots or Stoics or Christian martyrs. It is not the death that leans on some work or law or concept. It is the death that throws itself into God's arms, on God's mercy, on God's grace. And that alone is the gospel. So what then does all of that mean for us? For us to do as Jesus bids and take up our cross? The disciples didn't know what was coming, but we do know the end of the story, his crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. In the lessons in the last 2 weeks, we have Peter proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah and then rebuking Jesus when he describes and predicts just how his messiahship will play out. Peter just cannot hear the truth in Jesus' words about bearing his cross. Peter just cannot hear the truth about each of us bearing our cross. He just doesn't know what is coming. Jesus links taking up his own cross to us taking up ours. It seems counterintuitive to relinquish our identity in order to claim it, to lose our life in order to find it. After all, our culture elevates the self, so it seems crazy to give up the very thing we are supposed to value most. Here is Jesus telling us that not only is he willingly going to die, but that to follow him, we must willingly die. Let's face it. Death is a problem we all eventually face, and sometimes, maybe most times, fear. Whether it's death from disease or age, whether it's death of our church through attrition or conflict, we all have to face death. But all of that misses the point. Jesus is plainly telling us that in order to live, we must die. Giving up our lives is the only way we can gain the life that Christ promises. We have all heard and probably jokingly said, well, that's my cross to bear, referring to the old car or the extra 20 pounds or the grumpy neighbor or the problem child. Clayton Schmidt writes this, quote, "The problem is we are pretty poor at cross-bearing. Even to deny ourselves seems too much to ask. Here is both the challenge and the good news in this text. If we follow Jesus, we will be seriously called to bear certain crosses and lose hold of our lifestyle. Yet in all of our weaknesses and human-mindedness, it is Jesus' own death on the cross that enables us to do what we cannot. It is his burden we take upon our shoulders. It is his strength that bears the weight. We do nothing on our own, but he can do much through us. Without him, Peter was no rock, but a stumbling block. With him, Peter was the church. With him, we are not powerless to deny ourselves, but able to bear all that he may give us. Lloyd Ogilvie once put it this way, we say, but Lord, I cannot. And God says, I'm glad to hear you say that. Through you, I can. End quote. So just what does our own cross actually look like? Well, not all crosses are voluntary. An unsettling health diagnosis, the death of a loved one, the loss of a job. These are crosses we don't ask for. But when we accept them and trust God to be with us through them, then we are taking them up as crosses. To be sure, there are many other crosses that are voluntary. For example, tasks that we know will be difficult, but we choose to do anyway because they are beneficial to our family or community. And our crosses change over time. When we're young, our cross may mean standing up for what we believe, even when it's unpopular. It might mean saying no to friends, even when it threatens our friendship. When we get married and have children, there are new crosses, including times when we're called to put our spouse's needs and interests before our own, or caring about our child so much that we hurt when they hurt. Old age has its own crosses too, like giving up independence when we are no longer able to drive, learning to humble ourselves and rely on others for help through the day. You can get it right, still get it wrong. Our crosses, voluntary or involuntary, are part of what it means to follow Jesus. And what that means ultimately is to accept them gracefully and humbly and courageously. Let me say that again. What it means ultimately is to accept our crosses gracefully and humbly and courageously. So accept your cross. Trust Jesus. Follow him. I'm going to leave you with something I read this week by James Lawrence, and it's called, "What is the Shape of Your Cross?" Take up your cross, our Savior said, and follow me. But not all crosses are voluntary. Some we would choose, but others are given to us, not requested. The cross of stress or mental illness, of a hurting loved one. The cross of being born in the wrong place, of the wrong color skin, of abuse at the hands of another. Some crosses we can leave by the side of the road and should, moving on as best we can. Others are glued to our shoulders. All we can do is bear them with grace and courage. Not all crosses are taken up. Some crosses are given. But we serve him best who bear his mild yoke, the poet said. What is the shape of your cross? Did you choose it? Can you bear it? Should you? Is it the cross that your loving God would have you take up? Or is there another? Take up your cross, he said. And then he did, taking all that is broken and hurting in our world and placing it on his broad, faithful, dying shoulders. The shape of his cross, like the shape of his Father's love, full of the grace that sets our hearts free. His cross, our yoke, so gentle and humble, offering rest for our weary souls. Rest for our weary souls. Amen.